Packaging Industry 2040 Vision. My name is Paul Jenkins, Managing Director of UK Packaging Innovation Consultancy, and I'm joined today by Jo Stevenson.
Hi, I'm Jo. I am the Managing Director of PhD Marketing, which is a marketing agency that specialises in supporting packaging and print companies across the world. I'm also a co-founder of Women in Packaging in the UK, which is an initiative to help women network in the packaging industry. And then finally, I'm also on the board of EFIA, which is the Flexo Industry Association here in the UK.
Excellent. So Packaging Industry 2040 Vision. The year is 2040. Everything in the world is sustainable, digitised and omnichannel. We ask here in 2020, are we ready for the new age of packaging? So the first question that we're going to tackle is around COVID-19. So we've obviously had a global pandemic that has hit us. How has COVID-19, what lessons has COVID-19 taught us about sort of planning for the future, do you think, Jo?
Yeah, well, 2040 sounds a long way away, doesn't it? But 20 years in the packaging industry isn't terribly long. In fact, I can remember 20 years back, which is slightly worrying. Yeah, COVID's been really interesting. And when you and I talked before getting involved in this session, it's quite clear that the industry has learned some lessons that are quite telling for how we're going to progress towards 2040. Interestingly, we've been extremely fortunate in the packaging industry, with over 50% of the demand coming from the food packaging industry. Certainly, we've been pretty resilient compared to a lot of other sectors like cosmetics, sports, alcohol, and so forth. So most companies have been pretty buoyant, but there's been some key lessons learned, and really it's been about the agility and the ability of the industry to adapt to what have been very difficult and distressed circumstances. You know, on the one hand, we've had remote working suddenly impacting how companies run their businesses, but we've also had changes in the demand patterns and the products that are actually being supplied. So, for example, the supply chains became very stressed initially when the pandemic hit in most countries. We saw panic buying. Why toilet roll, none of us will ever know, but fundamentally products like that were winging their way off the shelves and the industry had to respond. In fact, one of the most notable ones for me was flour. Everybody started baking at home. We couldn't get hold of flour. It wasn't the flour mills were down, it was the physical packaging for flour is so unique today. It's an old-fashioned style of pack. We couldn't get hold of it. Capacity was out. So, you know, the net result of that was brands, as they suffered these unstable supply chains, was that they focused on SKU rationalization, limiting their ranges, streamlining their ranges to at least get something on shelf, rather than trying to get their entire ranges to market as they normally would. The biggest impact actually then being is that a lot of product launches, new range refreshes, brand extensions were either paused or stopped completely. Marketing staff at the brands were furloughed, and the efforts were just simply put into getting product to market rather than actually worrying about grabbing market share through new innovation. So what does that all mean for the packaging industry? What does that tell us about, you know, looking at 2040? Well, I think from my perspective, we learned as an industry quite a few lessons. We learned we weren't perhaps as agile as we thought we were. We weren't able to respond to some of these spikes in demand or troughs in demand that we experienced. And secondly, you know, the future is going to be pretty challenging for us in terms of that pace. We saw within 6 months fundamental shifts in the market. Consumers going online, changing buying patterns, changing product to material availability. And yet we couldn't all respond at the same time to those shifts. So if the pace of life, if the industry is going to accelerate towards 2040, as it has done in the last 20 years, we've got some challenges ahead in terms of flexibility and agility and maintaining our businesses without being disrupted. Did you see it like that, Paul? Is that what you've seen in your business?
Yeah, I mean, we've so much change and so much disruption. You've had you know, innovation departments and project teams having to work from home, and meetings that were scheduled and planned not going ahead, and that's clearly had a very short-term impact on everything, really. I mean, you just think about the exponential rate of change that we've experienced over the last 20 years. How e-commerce and some other things have come to the market. that change is increasing, and it's just really quite hard to predict what the market will be like in 5 years, let alone in 2040.
Exactly. And in fact, McKinsey's made a wonderful statement in one of their recent studies. In fact, if you've not got the McKinsey app, please download it. It's free information and they produce some fantastic reports. But they claimed that, well, stated that we've seen 5 years worth of innovation in e-commerce delivered in 5 months. I think that's a great way to describe it. People who'd never online ordered before were online ordering, and those of us who perhaps did it intermittently are now ordering every week online. So the pace of adoption of e-commerce has been tremendous. And I saw some stats pre-COVID, and forgive me, this is UK only data, but grocery online retailing was running at about 18% of demand. It hit a high of 45% at the peak of the crisis, and I think it's dropped back down again to the low 30s. But I call them the silver surfers, but you can imagine, if you're somebody who's needing to self-isolate or concerned about being in society while the pandemic is on, you've got used to online shopping and the convenience of that. Perhaps if you're older or infirm and don't want to go into a town centre or a supermarket, why would you revert back to the old days once the pandemic's over? I think, life is changing a lot for people, and the e-commerce market will benefit hugely from it.
Yeah, and they say about how long it takes for habits to form. I think 6 or 7 months of a pandemic, when you're having to shop at home through e-commerce channels. That this is a permanent change. So we're not going to go back to the levels of bricks and mortar shopping that we saw pre-pandemic.
I think one of the amazing things I found in a negative sense was. Pre-COVID, the packaging industry was under tremendous pressure from a variety of angles, both government, NGOs, and consumers, to address its sustainability credentials. And we talk about 2040 being everything is sustainable. But the shock for me was really seeing where sustainability ended up during the crisis itself. Did you pick up on that? Did you see it dropping off the agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the world went into survival mode, which is ultimately about self-preservation. There were lots of reports about the lack of recycling that was going on. Even the infrastructure was damaged because local authorities weren't even able to collect curbside and things like that. So went into a little bit of panic mode, I think, in terms of just making sure that our families and that was safe in this sort of, in the early days, sort of like the unknown of what was ahead of us. So we've certainly seen a lot of change in terms of the sustainability initiatives. The PACCUP has an innovation zone packaging database, so we track all the latest innovations. And we had about a 4 or 5 week period where nothing was coming through. It was a real struggle to deliver the content that we usually do on a weekly basis. And, it was what I mentioned earlier about the disruption with innovation departments and just not being able to administer those projects on a short-term basis. And it's almost your point earlier about the planning and companies having a need to sort of change their strategies and do the urgent things before they're able to do the sustainability initiatives. So it's definitely affected things. I think that the encouraging news is that we're seeing a lot of new initiatives coming to the fore over the last few weeks. So fingers crossed that we're back on that agenda, which is lots of sustainable packaging initiatives coming to market.
I think, and I've been known for saying this, one of my frustrations is I truly believe packaging in whatever form is a sustainable technology. It's a green technology. It's protecting carbon. It's preserving products, the freshness of them. It's protecting them from contamination. It's reducing waste in the supply chain. It's protecting goods from damage. And yet it is targeted and vilified as a product without people really understanding the role that it plays. And I questioned when I saw everything is sustainable for 2040. It's, well, what does that actually mean? It really depends on which lens you look through.
Yeah.
In a true sustainable sense, we wouldn't be utilizing resources and we wouldn't need packaging. Then we would be sustainable because the planet would be an abundance of resource. But that's not realistic. We have to eat. We're a growing population. By 2040, we're going to be at more or less 9 billion people on the planet, and these people need feeding and hydrating. And at the end of the day, I think is it 1.8 billion people today have unclean water and insufficient food. We're not managing our industrialized food chains appropriately today. And if we continue to focus too hard on packaging, and I'm not suggesting that packaging shouldn't be improved, it shouldn't be assessed and engineered to be the most efficient product possible, but I do worry that there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions gone on to the media hype over the last 3 or 4 years, and not always great decisions being taken in pack format changes. So I wonder, what does this sustainable world look like? Is a particular material going to win out, or are we going to get some balance back into the industry? Because there's been so much fighting, if you like, as I think we talked about, the aluminium guys will say their product's the most recyclable, the paper guys will say theirs is the most renewable and recyclable, the plastics boys will say it's the lightest weight, lowest carbon. It really just depends which lens you look through. So I wonder, I do hope there is balance coming into the market, and I'm from a plastics background, I'll hold my hand up, but I think what's been really interesting is consumers during COVID have been clearly buying on availability, but they've also been buying on hygiene and safety, and plastics have actually come back to the fore for many supermarkets in helping consumers shop safely. So whether there's a window of opportunity there for the plastics industry, I don't know, and that's probably a whole other hour's debate, but fundamentally, all packaging is green. It serves a purpose to protect and preserve and present. And I don't know what 2040 looks like. Do you have a view of where the argument will go?
Well, it's an interesting one, Jo, because if you go back to sort of October 2017, before the Blue Planet 2 program, sustainability was, for a lot of brands and retailers, they will admit a nice to have rather than a must have. And the Blue Planet 2 program really sort of focused everyone's minds on what needed to be changed, but it was very specific. It was all about plastic. So we've had 3 years really of plastic bashing in terms of reduction and elimination. And whether you agree with that strategy or not, you could easily imagine a scenario where another sort of big thought comes into our consciousness in terms of the importance of carbon footprint reduction, for example, where plastic can actually play a significant role. So this 2040 target is a long way off. You could feasibly have a scenario over the next sort of 12 to 18 months where the focus completely changes and suddenly plastic, if recycled, comes into vogue. So it's very hard to judge. Nobody in 2017 thought we'd be where we are now, COVID-19 aside. Nobody thought that at all.
I remember I have a client that produces flexible packaging, paper and plastic. And I remember fighting vehemently with them over their strategy to develop compostable products, because I just didn't believe in that linear process, even though it today would be described as biorecycling. But the reality is compostables have a place to play for non-recyclable flexible packaging laminates, and they're an excellent alternative as long as those materials can't be recycled. But you're right, in 3 years I managed to change my mind on compostables, and I've certainly stood up and spoken for much of the plastics industry, but I would equally stand up for glass, metal, paper, or whichever material you want to point at, because they all have virtues, they all have benefits in what they do in packaging. And I think 2040 will be a really interesting place to be, to see how that's played out, because fundamentally when we design packaging, it's utilizing the minimum amount of material possible. That should be the starting point. Then it's engineering the product to survive the rigors of the supply chain and protect the product. And then it's adding that all necessary consumer convenience and functionality that they're looking for in a pack. So if we have designed every packaging application to hit those holy grails, if you like, then I would argue the industry will be sustainable. But the way we infight at the moment and argue the virtues, it makes me wonder, to be honest. You've been doing quite a bit of work in refillable and reusable packaging as well, haven't you? That's starting to come to the fore.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Sorry, Jo. We've again, we can track all the latest innovations, and there's been a 68% increase in the number of refillable and reusable examples coming to market. And speaking to some of the industry experts that we've interviewed as part of a report we've just issued, they see the market being substantial in not 20 years, but 3 or 4 years, 30 or 40% of the market. And I guess my point here is this isn't something you can ignore. It's a bit like the analog printing guys ignoring the threat of or the opportunity of digital. The same can be said for packaging suppliers for refillable and reusable. If, there is every chance that this will be a significant part of the market in a few years, and cannot ignore it. You can, if you're a plastic bag manufacturer ignoring the threat of 5 pence charges a few years ago, you're now out of business. This is something that everyone really needs to get their head around. In terms of the report pre-sales, the vast majority of brands and retailers, so it's packaging suppliers are not engaging, and there is still a role for them to play because refillable and reusable packaging is packaging. So it still needs to be made, and it needs to be made robustly and with more materials and to last for a longer time. So we need to think about recyclability of those materials as well. So that, there is a future for the packaging industry for this growing refillable and reusable packaging market.
And I saw, was it Loop that is the first kind of foray into the market of a fully closed loop cleaning system? You personally tried that out, didn't you? I
have, yes. It's a very slick process. I think it's just been launched in the UK a couple of months ago. I ordered the day of launch. It arrived. Not only was I surprised I was able to order in my area, but I was able to order that day. It didn't crash or anything like that, and got the items a couple of days further down the line. It's quite expensive. It's quite there's a limited range, but their vision is extraordinary. They have they anticipate having their loop systems in retail. So you go to a shop, principally Tesco at the moment, and you will be able to drop off your empties and it'll be all electronic and easy to do. You won't have to take them out or anything like that. And you pick up a new load of reusable packaging. It'll be like an aisle that you'll see, like the pasta aisle that you currently see. It'll be full of reusable packaging, and that's suddenly when you take that e-commerce element out of it. Ironically, that makes it a bit more convenient for some consumers who don't want to be ordering online. They want to be able to and collecting all their reusables in. The big blue tote that you get with it is huge, and I'm lucky enough that my house is. I can find a place for it, but if you live in a flat inner city, that's not going to work.
Yeah.
So my point is, it's still very early days, but there's some big brands behind it. Obviously, UK's biggest retailer as well. They're going to succeed to some extent, and if you think about what they might be doing in 5 years, in 20 years, in 2040, it could be the wrong way to shop. You may not have single-use packaging.
And maybe a stupid question because I've not actually seen it, but does this mean the actual packaging design of the goods is changing? So if you buy a Heinz ketchup bottle, is it that's just being washed, hygienically cleaned, refilled, resealed, re-topped and out? Or is it that the actual packaging type is changing?
It's changing in that conventionally you would buy a PET plastic bottle for ketchup because it's more convenient, to be honest, because it's gravity fed and it's easy to squeeze. Interestingly, we bought the ketchup bottle and it lasted about a month. We get through loads of ketchup in our house, got 3 kids. But because the bottle is less convenient and they can't be bothered, the last 20% to spend time. So I had to take that on board. So there's two things really to note. The packaging is more premium, so you're getting glass instead of plastic. Okay. And sort of alloy type dispensers for pasta and things like that. Really nice
packaging type. So they are changing and perhaps upgrading to thicker materials, heavier gauge materials, so that they sustain longer. So actually, I'll call it the carbon spend up front is higher, but the fact that you're recycling over and over again.
Yes, that's the plan, and some really nice packaging formats. I think one of the challenges is going to be if you get a nice some pasta or biscuits in a nice aluminium or stainless steel jar, you might just want to keep that, and for say your 20 pence or 50 pence deposit. Yeah. And then if you do that, the whole model goes because they need to reuse it, X amount of times for it to be carbon negative, if you like.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? That you're up. It's a bit like going from the thin PE carrier bag to the thicker carrier bags for life, you're actually putting more material in, which is a higher carbon footprint product, but using it for longer. So in theory, the overall demand on the industry drops, but that certainly takes some time to play out when you're adopting systems.
But this is based on science. They're not doing this on a whim. They've really worked out that sort of sweet spot in terms of how many times the packaging needs to be reused for it to be of benefit to the environment from a sort of carbon footprint perspective. So, but it is, you're right, it's counterintuitive, because we bought some Coke bottles. They are really heavy. It's like going back to the 1970s. I've not seen such a heavy glass bottle in a long time. And my initial reaction was, this doesn't feel right. But obviously, it's been designed to last.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. It's interesting, isn't it? Some of these trends do feel like you're harking back to come forward again, don't they? So perhaps we did have it right before we started all this single-use work. But I think the biggest change, if we sort of take, now we've got these sustainable packaging loops, is if we look at 2040 is going to be that whole shopping consumer experience and where that all ends up. Clearly we've seen growth in omni-channel retailing as it's become known, and again, I think COVID was very indicative of the fact that a lot of brand retailers aren't ready for mass demand online, with queuing of systems and sort of what are essentially brochure websites falling over. But we've seen massive change in the high street in the last 5 to 10 years, unimaginable change. Who would have thought some of these brands that have disappeared would have disappeared? But I think, 2040 is going to be a completely different game in terms of the way the consumer shops. And I truly don't believe that's going to be all online. I think it's certainly going to be a huge part of the shopping experience, and certainly online is going to be integrated. But I've read quite a few articles on the one hand where things like your supermarket, it is a community experience, if you like, where, then I call it the Peter Kay Friday big shop's gone out the window. Everybody tends to shop in smaller amounts and more frequently now, or online. But supermarkets are really looking at how they can drive an experience in the supermarket space. So rather than perhaps a cafe or a dry cleaners around the edge of the store, perhaps as you walk up the coffee aisle, you can sit down and try the latest coffees with a donut from the bakery within the actual store. So that's going to have some huge ramifications again for the shopping experience, if you like. And the other interesting part I thought about, which then connects through to kind of this digitalized world that we anticipate by 2040, is the fact that digitalization of the industry is an additional burden to brands at the moment. And what I mean by that is the e-commerce supply is an adjunct to the supply into store. In the future, there's talk of you go, to a clothing retailer and they have, let's say you were buying a woman's skirt, sizes 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 on the rack. You try it on, decide which one you want, but you put it back on the rack and it stays there for somebody else to try on. You just then click on an app or somebody in store helps you, and it's just delivered to home by the time you get home. So instead of the brands having to manage huge supply chains behind the physical stores and behind the online experience, everything's streamlined to online, taking down cost in terms of managing it. And I think that's fascinating, because then when you sort of reflect that on the packaging side of the industry, do you need as much packaging is probably one of the questions. Does the packaging format change? Because it's not part of the consumer buying experience. It's just the secondary delivery method. And how then does our industry respond to that? So yeah, some fascinating change at the consumer level. Have you seen much reporting about that in terms of that consumer experience?
And I just think your scenario, shopping at a clothing outlet and then having it delivered by the time you get home, is fascinating and quite realistic in its practicality. And
the customer, I imagine, can't imagine why that would be. But if you think about the parallel supply chains that all have to be out there today to handle that, it's absolutely huge.
Yeah, and I've often thought with the migration to e-commerce, how primary packaging hasn't changed yet. I thought a few years ago that you'd have a scenario. If you walk down a shopping aisle and you see a Kellogg's cornflakes and it's got a big 40% off visual printed permanently on the pack, that's to entice you to pick it up in store. But that same pack is then delivered to you if you buy e-commerce. And I've often thought there must be what does the pack need to look like in an e-commerce environment? And it probably doesn't need to have loads of sales messages on there because you've already bought it.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I think for me, I work with a number of clients in kind of the digitalization space. And when I talk about digitalization, I mean both digitalization of the industry from brand artwork through to delivery, and also digital print. And people sort of confuse those two things. But in order for our industry to respond to the changes that we've just described, both in terms of demand patterns and volatility, consumer trends, sustainability changes, speed of market, the omni-channel retail world, we have to be digitalizing as an industry. And, you know, the technology is here today to do that. Today, you know, a brand can be developing artwork in New York, having repro done in Birmingham, printing in Poland and supplying Shanghai. And you can manage that whole workflow digitally. The days of emailing files and using FTPs are over. The cloud is here. And, you know, we are one industry, one world trying to get a product from A to B.
And 6 months ago, if you said you could have team meetings, client one-to-ones, all sorts of manner of Zoom type calls, nobody would have believed you. It won't work, it can't work, and it does work. So I guess sometimes when you're forced into these scenarios, sometimes that just sort of, you know, changes things a bit.
Pushes us. Yeah, and to that point, you know, in terms of our vision for 2040 and what it means for the packaging industry, I think there's some core lessons here in that, as you've said, who would have said you and I, Paul, would be sitting on a Zoom like this reporting for an audience that we can't see because, you know, these are the times that we're in. Things have changed massively, and we've learned in COVID for 6 months, but it's only indicative of the pace of change to come. And if our industry doesn't digitalize and embrace digital connection between the different players and collaboration and the innovation that can come as a result of that, as well as the opportunities that can be presented with digital printing for that reactive mode that we need to be in, I think those companies will fall away over the next 20 years because our industry has the potential to look massively different to how it looks now.
Yes, I totally agree. I would change the word potential to sort of definitely or something like that because it's definitely going to change.
Okay. Well, I don't know where we are on timing, but I think we've probably talked our way through kind of where we see the industry and some of the indicators that we're at today. We've talked about the need for change, the need for digitalization, the fact that sustainability is absolutely on the agenda, but there's going to be an interesting debate coming as to how it plays out for 2040. And I'd love to be around to see it because I'd like to see which is the winning technologies. But also the need for our industry to connect and collaborate in order to drive the innovation in things like the refillable packaging that you talked about, because there's some huge opportunities out there that perhaps we're not thinking about or thinking through fully enough at the moment.
I agree. My last point would be it's quite hard or impossible to plan for 2040, but you can plan for 2025. And the changes that are going on in the market now are where you need to be heading, really.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks very much, Paul. Really interesting debate. I always love talking to you because we're working with very similar clients, but in different parts of the industry. So I hope everybody who's watching has enjoyed today, enjoyed our debate. We're both on LinkedIn if you'd like to connect or ask any further questions, and enjoy the rest of the programme.